I think most people who think of Keanu Reeves in the early 90s, I think they think of him as, from Bill and Ted, The Excellent Adventure. I think people think of River Phoenix mainly because he died. But back in 1990, both of them appeared in a black comedy about a philandering restaurateur whose jilted wife goes about trying to assassinate him in various incompetent and ultimately hilarious ways. Outside of Keanu and River, the movie features a guy who speaks like Nintendo's Mario. He's the lead role, and I can't remember anybody else who's in the movie, to be honest. I could go on IMDb, but, you could do that too, so whatever. While there were plenty of terrible movies made between 1986 and 1995, I Love You to Death really isn't that bad. What makes the movie most memorable, though, is despite it taking place in Washington State, according to the movie, it's actually based on a truly bizarre story that takes place in Allentown back in the early 1980s. Tony Toto arrived from Italy in his early teenage years and settled with his family in New York City. He maintained a slight accent which his future wife Frances found attractive. The two married in their early 20s, and by the time the incidents we're going to be talking about today, the strange life-defining chapter of their lives takes place, they're in their late 30s. They've been married for 17 years and have 4 children, and they own a restaurant down on South 8th Street in Allentown. Frances is more reserved than Tony. She is aware that her husband has been hooking up with women at clubs he's going to. He enjoys dressing sharp, making people laugh, and he's not a bad-looking guy, staying in shape, does martial arts. He's got a lot of girlfriends. Frances is frustrated not only with Tony's infidelity, but also with being away so much. He's working 10, 12, 14, sometimes more hours a day, and when he is home, he can be abusive, and he's known to push her around. Frances gets to the point where she can't think of a better way out than killing her husband in a way that makes it look accidental and thus enables her to save face and collect life insurance. Her first attempt takes place in the summer of 1982. So the Totos have a modest house a few blocks off Route 222, and Frances has to tripwire across the top of their front porch steps. Tony stumbles over the wire, rolls down the cement steps and into the yard relatively unhurt, and a few days later, somebody tries to attack him in the same yard with a baseball bat, but the bat gets stuck in a bush, and the assailant, having lost the element of surprise, lets go of the bat and runs for it. I can only imagine that Tony is staring, profoundly confused, or maybe not. Maybe he figured it was a cuckold boyfriend of one of his lady friends. After the episode of the man in the bush, the police become involved, but they're not yet aware that the would-be assassin has actually been hired by Tony's wife, Frances. There isn't much time between the man in the bushes with the bat and the failed attempt to booby-trap Tony's 1982 Lincoln. A bomb, wired up by somebody, fizzles when Tony tries to turn the ignition, and he drives away unscathed and really unaware of the attempt on his life. There may have been a second time to make this car bomb, but I've seen it reported as just a singular incident, so I'm not really sure on that. In January of 1983, just a few months later, a man who is Tony's daughter's boyfriend, it comes out later, a man finds Tony napping in his bed, and so he shoots him in the head before leaving the house without taking anything. Frances attempts to nurse Tony back with soup laced with sleeping pills, which doctors later credit with possibly having saved Tony's life, ironically enough. Increasingly desperate and angered by the apparent incompetence that is the other people in her scheme, Frances brings in 2 hitmen. Actually, 2 teenage cousins, Ron and Dawn, and she orders them to do the direct shoot him in the sleep treatment, for again, a second time around. This will make the second time someone has tried to shoot Tony as he sleeps, and Frances figures that Tony's head must be thicker than she originally suspected, and instructs Ron and Dawn, whose names make them sound like cartoon ducks to me, she instructs them to aim for his heart instead, switch it up a bit. So Dawn and Ron, standing over Tony, who is apparently a pretty heavy sleeper, these two new characters are debating exactly where in the general torso area of the human heart lives. Utilizing the Pledge of Allegiance from school as a map of sorts, they squeeze the trigger, shooting Tony in the chest and yet somehow miraculously miss hitting anything of mortal import. Dawn and Ron run. Tony sits straight up in bed and tries to figure out what all the noise is about. Francis, who's in the house, watches Tony walk around the living room for a while before he returns to bed. The next day, following a tip from a person who overheard the two rhyming named cousins bragging about having shot Tony, the police arrive. Francis has already contacted a lawyer and Tony is still laying in bed, wounded. So if you're trying to keep track at home, here's what the scoreboard looks like. 1. Tripwire on the front steps. 2. Man in the shrubs with a baseball bat. 3. 1, possibly 2 attempts to turn a sweet Lincoln sedan into a fiery inferno with Tony inside. 4. 1 bullet in the head. 5. Bullet in the head is followed up by drugged chicken noodle soup. And finally, all this is capped off with number 6. Another bullet, this time to the heart, but, really only in the neighborhood of the heart. Francis, Dawn and Ron, and Bruno, the daughter's boyfriend, who was the guy who lodged a bullet in the brain, are all charged with attempted murder, among other things. And that's when the story starts to get weird. Because it's around this time that Tony bails Francis out of prison before the trial. $50,000 is put up, is what I've read, looking at old newspaper articles. He hires a lawyer on her behalf and even testifies not against, but for his wife at the trial. He blames Bruno, the boyfriend of his daughter, and states that this 20-something-year-old is jealous of his good family and his good job. And despite Tony's request that the charges against Francis be dropped, the court sends Francis to the women's prison in Muncie out by Williamsport. Tony remains faithful to his wife, and he and the children speak to her daily on the phone. In media interviews, Tony says that the two of them still have a lot of good years ahead of them, and the nightlife and the girlfriends were just a distraction from his real love, his family. Tony says he's learned a lesson and that he's turning a corner. He even contemplates opening a pizzeria closer to the prison. But he doesn't do this. Tony instead gets a lighter job with regular, fewer hours. He goes back to working as a printer, which is something he had done prior to starting a pizzeria out in Allentown. Frances spends the last few months of her term in a less restrictive prison in the Pittsburgh area. Ultimately, she would only serve 4 years. I believe she was sentenced to 10. And she returned to Allentown and to Tony. And on the night that she returned, they ordered pizza. Following her release and the sale of the rights to their story to a Hollywood producer, Tony and Frances did a tour of talk shows, including Carson, because, this is still the 1980s. And the film adaptation of Frances' attempts to kill Tony, the aforementioned I Love You to Death, it does alright in box office. It does modest. Frances can't profit from her crimes, but as the victim, Tony can, making it kind of a moot point. A lot of their neighbors had pretty strong feelings, though. Not that this bothered Tony too much. A lot of people in their immediate neighborhood actually ended up moving away, and Tony speculated in an interview later on that this was probably because of so much media attention that was going around, and a lot of the neighbors were being hounded. But just a lot of people in Allentown, which is not a small city in the Commonwealth, were kind of thought it was kind of a blight upon their town and didn't want to have this story be a portrayal of really what Allentown's like. The movie was not very popular in Allentown. During an interview that occurred in the early 90s, around the time the movie was coming out, it was noted that Tony had a bunch of the movie memorabilia in the house. I personally think that's bad form. It's kind of like being that guy that goes to the show with a shirt of the band that's playing, and it's not like a shirt that he bought at the show and it's just wearing because it's easier than trying to hold it the whole time. That guy. Tony and Francis state that the film adaptation of their story is, quote, 99% accurate. They do point out the fact that the sleeping pills were in a bowl of chicken noodle soup and not a bowl of spaghetti. As the interview circuit and the hype following the film died down, Tony is arrested in September 1992. He was trying to break up with a new girlfriend in her apartment and in the process had knocked out some of her front teeth. Tony's lesson was apparently short-lived, despite still having a bullet lodged in his head. Following this incident, Tony and Francis stopped talking to members of the press. That is until Joan Rivers died. In September of 2014, Tony and Francis were interviewed by their local paper about their memories of appearing on Joan Rivers' show. The article isn't particularly enlightening about anything regarding Joan Rivers, but it would be the first time that the Toto spoke about their bad romance in more than 20 years. So yeah, in September of 2014, the two of them are still married. They say that divorce has never really crossed their mind. They don't understand why people get divorced for silly reasons. But let's be honest, I don't understand why divorce has so much more gravity than trying to kill your spouse, but that's me. This year, at the time of this recording, Tony and Francis are both going to be in their 70s, and I don't know what any of us are supposed to get out of that story. And no, in the most recent interview, it did not mention if Tony still had the bullet in his head, but that was one of the things I was really curious about. So that's the story of I Love You to Death. Its origins in Allentown, and again, I don't know what you're supposed to get out of that story. It's certainly not uplifting, but there it is. And if nothing else, it can make you feel a lot better about your worst relationship, most likely. If it doesn't help put some perspective in, then you better write that down and sell the rights to Hollywood. If you have any pictures or comments, stories, or whatever, feel free to email us at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.